Hey guys, Paul here. So today I wanted to talk about a phenomenon in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I've basically dubbed gatekeeper cards. It's the best word I could come up with, but I guess I'll just describe them and maybe somebody in the comments has a better one. But basically it's these cards that kind of like toe the line between sort of good, like strong meta decks, whatever you want to call them in Yu-Gi-Oh, and like decks that are low power or lower tier or whatever. And so I think one of the best examples of this card is Nibiru. And the reason I mentioned Nibiru is actually because recently on the ban list, Apollosa got banned. And this is obviously a really big deal for a number of reasons. It's kind of another one of those hits to like generic extract cards, which I generally like. And one of the points that got raised a lot when people are kind of just talking about like where that, what that means for the game and stuff, is that it means that a lot of your average kind of combo pile decks will have one less way of dealing with Nibiru. Nibiru, of course, being like, your opponent has summoned 5 times, so you can use Nibiru to like, clear the board and kind of typically stop their turn. And Nibiru to me has always been like an interesting case because it's one of these gatekeeper cards where every time I've seen Nibiru really be played, it tends to kind of fit into this role of like, the best decks in the game can typically play around Nibiru quite easily or play through it. So by that could either mean they can make something like Apollosa within like, 4 or 5 summons, or Barone back when that was legal or whatever. If you're playing Master Duel, those are both still legal, Jesus Christ. But yeah, these decks can put up some sort of a monster negation by their 5th summon so that Nibiru is not an issue for them. Or if they get hit by Nibiru, they just kind of can still somehow find a way to keep playing through it. For the longest time with Snake Eyes, this is usually through like Divine Temple, but plenty of decks actually have ways to like link away the token or bring something back from the grave and kind of keep comboing or whatever. But it's typically like the better decks. And meanwhile, Nibiru can be an extremely polarizing and in some cases fun killing card for low tier decks. One of the prime examples is like, Alec always tells the story. He and Larry were playing and he was using like, I think Plunder Patrol, and Larry used Nibiru on him and it was like this whole thing. But basically, and I think this is before they'd gotten the Fusion Monster lease, so that kind of just changed the scenario a little bit. But basically, lower tier decks typically don't have a way of dealing with Nibiru, higher tier decks typically do. And so it puts Nibiru in this weird spot where it's not exactly doing maybe its full job. Like Nibiru was created alongside that's Dark Ruler No More and Dimension Shifter in 2019. It was kind of just created to like check the metagame. But I don't know that it actually like does that job all that well, because it's like, well, the best decks can play around Nibiru and the worst decks can't. But what really happens there is it's like, I guess like Nibiru becomes a gatekeeper and just sort of a barometer of like, can a deck hang in like, I guess a tournament setting or something like that. Now there's other factors too. Sometimes players will forget about Nibiru as a factor and just make a mistake, and maybe they could have actually insulated themselves from it or played through it or played around it or whatever. But typically I find that Nibiru sort of acts as just this card that tells low tier decks, yeah, maybe you got to do your thing or you're getting to play or whatever, but like this kind of stamps it down. And so what I mean by like Nibiru not really fulfilling its role is it doesn't really tame top decks, it just tames low tier decks and kind of defines tiers in that way. Another card that kind of comes to mind for me with something like this is actually just a lot of the sort of board breaker cards. So cards like maybe Lightning Storm, perhaps Evenly Matched kind of fits in here, where like they're supposed to nuke your opponent's board, right? Like if I use Lightning Storm, I can destroy all your monsters. But we obviously know that in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, that's not exactly, just as cut and dry as it might sound. In addition to just players generally being able to play around a card like Lightning Storm by maybe putting their boss monsters in defense position, the bigger thing is that usually there is a negation for the Lightning Storm anyway. So the best decks don't really lose to Lightning Storm because they can negate it, but low tier decks sometimes don't really have that option. And so a Lightning Storm or an Evenly Matched suddenly just clears their board and there's not like any retribution for it. And so I've found that these gatekeeper cards, I guess I wonder if there's a way for Konami, like where do you land on them in terms of like casual play? Like that's, I guess, what I'm really getting at here. I know that in a tournament, people are going to be playing the best stuff, and you should kind of expect Nibiru can happen. You can expect Lightning Storm, whatever. But oftentimes, when I play just with my friends, kind of at the house or whatever, we sort of have a set of house rules where we just don't really allow Nibiru to be played, or we won't play evenly matched. Sometimes even Ash Blossom, just because like so many low tier decks don't really have extenders, and so one Ash Blossom is enough to kind of shut down a turn in many cases. Like if a deck starts off with 1-for-1 and it gets ashed, that's it. Or like one of the examples I always give is that 6 Samurai Link monster where it's like it takes 2 6 Samurai monsters and you summon it and you have to discard a card, and like if that gets like hit with Valor, for instance, then that's that, right? So a lot of low tier decks typically have like these linchpin cards where like if it gets stopped they can't play, but obviously high tier decks, Yubel, Snake Eye, things like that, don't really have that problem. So when we do house rules, we'll usually kind of avoid using hand traps and kind of the more polarizing cards like that. But I guess I bring it up because it's like, I still think that those cards are actually really well designed. Like I think that they certainly have a clear purpose. Hand traps like Ash Blossom were made to curb the power of a deck that, maybe searches a lot of stuff. Nibiru can curb the power of a deck that summons too much. It's just that I think maybe that's a bit of an issue in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that like the best decks have been subsequently, so it's weird, right? Decks summon a lot, so Konami makes a card like Nibiru to kind of like curb it. But then newer decks kind of get these built-in ways of playing around Nibiru, so now Nibiru's use against the best decks is kind of diminished or limited, but it still is good against like all the rest of the field in a way that's almost polarizing. And like that's always weird to me because it's like, is Nibiru really the problem, or is it just the Band-Aid solution that also kind of destroys a lot of like low tier decks along with it? It's really odd. It's like, I don't know, that's why I call it a gatekeeper, because I think that it is a card that doesn't actually affect the best decks very much, but affects everything else a lot. And the same thing goes for so many other cards. And it's like, where do we land on them as cards? Like, do you think that this is good card design? That a card like Nibiru can basically shut down a low tier deck, but like kind of keep a high tier, like high tier decks don't have to worry very much about it? Or am I maybe not even like looking at it right? Because technically, even if high tier decks can play around Nibiru, the fact that they have to play around it still means that there was some impedance to their plans, and so maybe in that way Nibiru is still functioning as intended. The same thing goes for Lightning Storm, where it and like even Change of Heart and Snatch Steal and stuff like these days, because those cards have been coming off the ban list, they have just taken on a new role when it comes to facing like going second and facing down a really strong combo board. Right? You're not actually expecting your Change of Heart or your Lightning Storm to resolve, but rather you're using it as a bait for like to bait out the negation so that now you can play with other things. And maybe that's just kind of how they're going to function in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I still don't think it really solves the problem of like these being overpowering and polarizing cards for low tier play or like more casual levels of play. But I do think that it kind of helps to, I guess, rationalize and explain the role that they've gotten. I am trying very hard here, as you guys probably know, to not just go into like one of my rants or complaints about this, because I do think, the darker, maybe less charitable side of me would say, yeah, so basically Konami kind of made this game overpowered, made Band-Aid solutions, and then made cards that get around those Band-Aid solutions, so what was the point of them? But I guess I'm more so just interested in like, where people listening like land on them and how they should be like incorporated into more casual levels of play. Like, we all have this grand idea of like a lower power level format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where like only the less powerful archetypes and stuff can be used. But in that imaginary format where like maybe Yubel, Snake Eye, and like just whatever the current top stuff isn't allowed, do you still allow Nibiru? Do you still allow like what hand traps get allowed, which ones don't? Like I think Nibiru is probably agreed upon to be a more polarizing hand trap than like Effect Veiler is, but some people don't like hand traps at all. And same with like board wipes, because board wipes really hit low tier decks harder than they hit like high tier decks. So if you're playing in like a low, hardly underdog, kind of low power level format, are Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched still fine because those decks maybe don't have ways to negate them? So I don't know, just kind of some food for thought. I'd love to hear what people have to say about it. As always, I like kind of just talking the talk with Yu-Gi-Oh! Trying to put a more like inquisitive spin on these rather than just saying, oh, Yu-Gi-Oh! So broken and beyond repair. Because I do think that, again, these cards had jobs and they do fulfill roles. So I don't think they're just objectively bad for the game, but I want to know where people land on them. Anyways, okay, that's enough of that. Hopefully you guys liked the video. Thumbs if you liked it, sub if you loved it. You can also join as a channel member here on APS Amplifier. We're going to be trying to have some benefits for people who listen to the Pot of Greed podcast, and so that'll like technically go, or just across the whole channel. So whatever, you can look into that if you want. Information will be down in the description. All right, it's going to be it. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bad turn.